When did I become the patriarch or matriarch of my family? Looking out at the gray hair in the room from some of you, I know that some of you already wear that mantle, but some of us are surprised with that. Sometimes you become the patriarch or the matriarch when you frankly aren't the oldest one in your family. There may be health issues for someone who should have been making those decisions, and they have a disease or a chronic condition or something that limits them from being able to make those decisions. So we look at this topic, we have a couple of questions that we often ask. How did this happen? I'm not old enough to be the patriarch. I'm not old enough to be the matriarch. And sometimes we struggle with that. The next question that we ask sometimes is, do I have a choice? You may not. I recently, this past summer, went through an issue where my father, who was 91, had a stroke, and all of a sudden, my mother, who's only a couple years behind him, is turning to all of her children and saying, you tell me what to do. We weren't expecting to have to do that. And yet that's what happens sometimes when health crises come into play. So the question then becomes, what must I do now? You are the patriarch, you are the matriarch. You're the one who's in a position to help make these decisions, and it really is guiding a family through a sacred time. Pope Francis, literally just this last Saturday, he must have known we were having this conference. He was actually addressing a group of priests in Italy, and he talked about your witness by word and example. Human life is always sacred. That's what we're here for. We're here to talk about the sacredness of human life and how, as Catholics in our faith tradition, we appreciate that and we act on that in our lives. The title of our conference is Faith, Hope, and Love. And we look at these as cardinal virtues, the things that we encounter in all of our life, but what do they mean at the end of life? C.S. Lewis talks about prayer. He talked about praying because I cannot not pray. And he goes on to say something that I think is important. Prayer doesn't change God. Prayer changes us. God's all-powerful, God's supreme being. Our prayer does not change God, but it absolutely, through his grace, his comfort that comes to us as we pray, it changes us. So it's a profound need for the human person to pray. Henri Nouwen talks about what it means when we're facing death. That constant opening up of ourselves to what's beyond. We will all pass from this life one day, and we will all be blessed, we hope, with the richness of the funeral rites, the richness of, as we approach that, being surrounded by family and friends. You know that last line of the Hail Mary that you've all said so many thousands of times, now and at the hour of our death? This is what we're talking about today. We're talking about now and at the hour of our death. And that becomes part of our prayerfulness as we approach this topic. You will hear from speakers today the invitation to you to dare to take charge of this whole process, to have this conversation. Earlier this week, there was an article on an online news service, Crux Now, from the Boston Globe, and they talked about this as the conversation with C in capital letters. And in the article, the author was talking about this conversation between children and parents sometimes, or parents and children. They said it's kind of like that birds and the bees talk. You need to have it, but you don't want to have it. And that's an interesting perspective to cast this in. We all need to have these conversations with our loved ones to express our own interest and to find out what they have in mind for us. Dr. John Bertinoli is also a deacon in the Diocese of Trenton. Dr. John, who's on the staff at Rowan University School of Medicine, was trained at Harvard in hospice care. And he doesn't speak very highly necessarily of doctors and of some parish priests. And John's concern for it comes from this perspective, is that he said doctors in particular, they're not trained for hospice. They're trained for the big save. They're trained to say whatever the next symptom is that you can present to them, they've got something up their sleeve to deal with it. Sometimes that ends up prolonging the process of dying that we're all going to confront in ways that are not healthy. Not healthy spiritually, not healthy emotionally, we're starting to play God when we start to say, well, let's try one more experimental treatment. So we need to be wary of that as we take charge of our own end-of-life issues. Father Bruce Morrill talked about physicians managing the phenomenon of death. We need them to manage our health. But I think we need to turn to our church more often to manage the process of our death and the spiritual dimension of what that means as we go forward. There is definitely a spiritual growth that takes place in the dying process. You'll hear some of the speakers today talk and mention about hospice care and where that fits into the scheme of things. Hospice care is defined as that period when medical staff have said, this person has less than 6 months likely to continue living. Sadly, that's the same definition that the state of New Jersey and the state of Oregon and other places have when they talk about assisted suicide. They said you're eligible for that if the doctors have said you have less than 6 months to live. But what they miss completely is that in this sacred time, there may not be physical healing, but there's incredible spiritual healing, emotional healing. The family members that may not have spoken to each other for 30 years, they don't even remember why they're not talking. Suddenly at the bedside of an elderly parent, they set that aside and they are healed. And they come together as a family. And this is what happens when we gather together and we have a focus on the spiritual dimension of our end-of-life issues. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote about the process of death and dying back in the 70s, still quite an expert on that. And when she speaks about this, she's talking about that's surrender at the end of life, one of those stages of dying. Surrendering to what is inevitable is not necessarily a painful thing. Yes, physically we may be experiencing pain. Emotionally, we are probably experiencing some pain, but when we surrender to that, we're actually surrendering into the embrace of God. Because that's who's calling us at that time. That's who's calling our loved one when we're saying, oh, don't give up. They're not giving up. They're reaching out. They're yearning to say, I'm ready to be in God's embrace once again in a more full way than we can be in our lives here on earth. Hope and companionship at the end of life. It's sad when someone dies alone. Sometimes they are virtually alone because family members are rejecting the inevitable. They refuse to admit that mom or dad or my brother or my sister or sometimes my child is dying. But we need to embrace that. We need to say, this is what God calls us through. This is in our baptism ritual. And at the end of the day, I know Msgr is going to speak about how the funeral rites of our church really are rooted in the baptism rites of our church. That's what we're about as men and women of faith, that we're called to be once again with God at the end of our time here on planet Earth.